focus of our study is on two men, Erasmus and Luther, and tonight we come to Erasmus. We've been leading up to it, kind of setting the stage for the ideas that are out there in the church. Ideas about man and how strong his will is, how effective his will is. One of the protagonists in this great controversy that we're going to look at in the 16th century was a man named Desiderius Erasmus. Now, his name was Erasmus, and Erasmus comes from the Greek word for love, eros, because you see, he was born of a love union, so to speak, between a Dutch priest and his housekeeper. They were not married, of course, to each other. It was an embarrassment to Erasmus that he was illegitimate, and he finally got a dispensation from the Pope to make him legitimate. Also, he played around with his birthday because he probably was born somewhere near 1469, but he tried to push that back to say that he really was born earlier at a time when his mother and father were married, and then his father took holy orders, dissolved the marriage, and thus explaining the fact he was a priest. So we're not sure exactly when he was born, somewhere between 1466 and 1469 in Rotterdam, in the Netherlands, in what is now Holland. His father was a very well-educated man, and maybe Erasmus inherited some of that. We don't know much about the mother. She came from the town of Huda. They also gave this young child only one name, Erasmus, love child. So he thought that didn't sound too distinguished. Everybody had two names, at least two names, so he gave himself his second name. He named himself Desiderius. Desiderius means the same thing in Latin that Erasmus means in Greek, so I suppose if we translated his name fully, it would be love, love. Two loves there. His parents died when he was very young. They died of the plague. And being an orphan now, he was placed in the care of the Brethren of the Common Life. We talked last time about Gerhard Grute, who established the lay order called the Brethren of the Common Life. They were an order that took in orphans, that helped students. They were focused on good works. And they took this young boy in and took care of him. Later, they helped him to enroll in the Augustinian monastery of the Canons Regular at Stein. That was 1482. Now, Augustinians were noted as being the most theologically correct orthodox of any of the orders. They always had been. They, of course, took the doctrines of St. Augustine very seriously. And they also were very well committed to learning, and they had good libraries. Erasmus found at a very young age that he loved to read. He loved books, and he loved the library in the monastery at Stein. And that to him is what the monastery meant, a good library. He never lived like a monk. He didn't stay very long at the monastery of Stein. He went out and lived among the people. But he never broke his vows. The vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. Now, I think he probably would have loved to have broken the vow of poverty, because he was always complaining about not having enough money. But the Lord saw to it, I suppose, that he kept that vow. The vow of chastity, he kept. The vow of obedience, well, he was faithful to the order, but he didn't live there in the monastery. And that really wasn't wrong. They didn't require monks to live in monasteries. They could go out. But he didn't do anything to disgrace the Augustinian order. The monks were good to him, and they saw his tremendous potential. They used to think of him as another, perhaps, Jerome. Remember Jerome, who translated the Bible into Latin, the Vulgate. He has the potential of being a great scholar, and so they helped him obtain a position as Latin secretary to Bishop Henry of Cambrai in 1494. Now, I should tell you that this young man developed a real skill at Latin. Latin was the language of the learned community. It was a language of lawyers. It was a language of priests in the church. It was a language of the court. All educated people spoke Latin. Now, today we'd say Latin is a dead language, but it wasn't a dead language then. It was a living language. There were new words being added to the vocabulary. And Erasmus was as proficient a Latin scholar as there ever was. His writings are very difficult to translate. But there was another reason that he got this job as Latin secretary. And that is the fact that this bishop, Bishop Henry, was hoping to get an appointment as cardinal. And if he got an appointment as cardinal, he would go to Rome. And if he went to Rome, he'd take his secretary with him. And Erasmus wanted to get to Rome, to get to Italy. You see, as this Renaissance comes across the Alps into the north, it retains this emphasis on Italian culture and Roman culture. And so anyone living in the north considered that his education was incomplete until he had made what they called the Italian trip, until he got to go to Italy. So Erasmus wanted to make the Italian trip, but he didn't have the money. So he saw an opportunity. If Bishop Henry gets the red hat, then he can go with Bishop Henry to Rome, and he makes the Italian trip. But unfortunately, he never got the red hat. Bishop Henry's ambitions were disappointed. And so Erasmus was disappointed, and the monks helped him become accepted and enroll in the University of Paris. So he went there to pursue his college education. He never finished it. He never got his college degree. Once again, he turned in later years to the Pope, and the Pope will give him a dispensation for his college degree as well as a dispensation to make him legitimate. He enrolled in the College of Montaigu at the University of Paris. It was one that was inexpensive, very cheap. He could afford it. Very austere. Students did not live a life of ease in that college. It was very, very difficult. Very few provisions were there. While he was there, he went to the lectures, and he attended some of the lectures in theology that were delivered by the scholastics, and he found them just completely boring. He thought it was stuffy. He thought that it was not meaningful, not relevant to his life, and it was trivial. So he just had a bad taste for scholastic theology, for lectures on Thomism, the Thomistic viewpoint, and so forth. However, there were a group of students meeting on campus that were humanists, that had picked up the humanist ideas from Italy. Now, the university, which was an arm of the church, operated by the church, would not allow humanistic studies in the classroom. But that didn't prevent humanist students from forming little study groups and discussion groups. And so Erasmus was attracted to them and got involved with these humanists and made many close friends, including Jean Vitrier, who was a Neoplatonist, and several others. Vitrier and others had picked up the Neoplatonic ideas from the Italian Renaissance. And you got to understand that Neoplatonism, which was very popular in the Renaissance, is almost a religion. Very mystical, but it was very personal. One seeks a union with God through all kinds of emanations and levels of reality that come forth from God, and you seek to move up through those levels of reality. So Neoplatonism was, in one sense, an answer to the impersonal, cold, formal, and very complicated theology of the scholastics. He flirted with Neoplatonism. In two of his works, he included some Neoplatonic thoughts and ideas, but he never became a thoroughgoing Neoplatonist. It is at this point that Erasmus began to write his letters, and we can trace every aspect of Erasmus' life from his letters. He was a meticulous letter writer. He wrote to everybody, and we still got the copies of them today. So he's going to tell you what he thinks, what he likes, and he's going to give you his opinions, his ideas. you can get just a pretty good picture of the life of Erasmus from his letters. They started at the University of Paris. He complained continually, and he seemed very petty in some of the things that he talked about. He didn't like the wine in this place. He hated fish. Anytime they served fish, he found that disgusting. Strange, he came from Holland, and yet he didn't like fish. He was always griping about ill health. He was probably a hypochondriac. He was thinking he was going to die at any minute, and he lived to be 70. While he was at the University of Paris, an event happened that changed his life. He got an invitation from a friend of his. He had made an acquaintance of a young English nobleman named William Blount. And William Blount was Lord Mountjoy. And Lord Mountjoy invited him to go home with him at the spring break, the spring vacation, and visit England. He'd never been to England before. The year is 1499. And William Blount took him to Chelsea. And there at Chelsea was the estate of Sir Thomas More, the humanist who wrote the Utopia. And there's a circle of Christian humanists that gathered at Chelsea. And More, who met Erasmus through William Blount, then would introduce Erasmus to these other humanists that were there. And among them would have been the patron of this little circle, Prince Henry, who later became Henry VIII, and who later was responsible for executing Thomas More. What was amazing about the circle at Chelsea was that they were into Christian studies. They were committed to the study of the Bible, of the original text of Scripture. They were committed to studying the early church fathers. They were applying there at Chelsea the same critical mechanisms that had been used in Italy to determine the accurate text of the Greek and Roman writers to the Christian works. In other words, they were committed to Christian scholarship. Moreover, they were committed to try to reform the church because they believed that all the corruption in the church at that time would be corrected by proper knowledge. If you could just help people understand the Bible and understand what Christianity is really about, then it would solve the problems. All this nonsense that was going on, immorality, greed, buying church offices, all of this would stop if people were properly educated. And so they were committed to reform by education, using the Bible as the basis for that. He was really taken with this. As a matter of fact, he committed his life to the cause of Christian humanism, to being a Christian humanist. Of course, the circle at Chelsea was delighted to have Erasmus involved with them. And John Colet, who was a part of that circle, we talked about him in our last study. He had inherited money, founded St. Paul's School for Boys, was a professor at Oxford University where he taught the Bible. He said to Erasmus, "Please stay, and you and I will teach the Bible together at Oxford." But Erasmus said, "No, I cannot. I would love nothing better than to stay at Oxford and teach the Bible, but I cannot teach the Bible until I can teach it from the Greek. Until I know the Greek, I would not dare to teach the New Testament unless I had a Greek New Testament I was teaching from, and I knew what I was talking about, and I don't know Greek." That seems strange. Perhaps one of the most proficient Latin scholars of his day did not know Greek. And he wanted to do this, but he just conscientiously couldn't until he studied Greek, so he spent the next 6 years of his life studying Greek, teaching himself, and he had a very difficult time doing it. You would think it'd be simple, but it wasn't. For him, it was extremely difficult. Eventually, he became a good Greek scholar, and you will see how important that is going to be in a moment. His reputation as a scholar, meanwhile, is growing. We'll look at his works in just a second. But he was committed to Christian studies, and he was determined to take up the challenge that was offered to him by Colet to explain the Christian tradition based on the texts of Christianity, the Bible and the early Christian writers. But let's turn our attention now to his works, because it was the next year after his visit to England, and he loved England. Oh, the people are so wonderful there. They're so nice. It's so much better than the continent, he said. He just fell in love with England. So the next year, after that visit to England, he published his first work. And thereafter, he became a famous writer. He became the most famous writer of his age, the most feared, the most respected. His works were always on the bestseller list. They could hit the bookstores, and the customers were standing in line to buy them. Unfortunately, Erasmus never got any money from them because there were no copyright laws at that time to see that the money actually went back to the author. But as far as his reputation, he hit the ground running, so to speak, and it just went nowhere but up after that. The first publication that he did was a work called the Adagia. It was subsequently revised and enlarged. Now, what is the Adagia? Well, first of all, it's a classical book. It is not a Christian work. It is a Greco-Roman work. And so that put him in the field of classical scholarship. But if you're familiar with Bartlett's book of familiar quotations, then you know what the Adagia was. When you want a quotation, you can go look it up in Bartlett's book of familiar quotations. You get a quotation, you can throw it into your work. Well, back then, this is before Bartlett lived, so this was the reference book that was still lacking. Back in the 14th century, Giovanni Boccaccio in Florence, Italy, had written and composed and published a book of mythology. And that was the first reference book of the Renaissance. And then the second work he produced was geographical place names in classical literature. So you've got an encyclopedia of geographical places, and you have an encyclopedia of mythology. Well, thereafter, there were all kinds of encyclopedias and dictionaries that came out, and the only one that was still lacking, really, was this one on the quotation. So now, if you want a quotation on love, or if you want it on courage, or truth, or whatever you want, you just look it up. You look up love, you look up truth, you look up courage. And there it is. There are all the quotes from the writers. And you might think, how could this man be able to put down all of the quotes, all the references from the Greek and Roman writers on all these different subjects? I will never forget a day I was walking with my professor back to the library on the campus where I was doing my graduate work, and he said, you know, Erasmus was one of these guys that read every book that was published. Now, there's no way we could do that today, not in a lifetime. But back in the 16th century, you could read every published book. He read every one of them that he could, and evidently got around to just about all of them, if not all of them. And furthermore, my professor said, he remembered nearly everything that he read. Now, I don't know about you, but I can't do that. I cannot remember everything I read. Erasmus could. It's amazing. The man was a tremendous intellect. So that's the book of quotable quotes. The second book that he did is called the Colloquies. Now, the Colloquies, like little conversations, it grew out of teaching. Now, he hated teaching. He didn't like to teach, but he had to teach because he needed the money. He also would have to secure money, if he couldn't get it through teaching, from patrons who would give him money. And he despised that too. So he was a good teacher, but he didn't like it. And he taught Latin, of course, to children. Now, back then, they did have grammar books that gave the rudiments of the Latin language, but they didn't have any exercises. So the teacher had to make up the exercises. Well, he made up exercises. They were funny. And the students laughed at them. And they seemed to be exercises that poked fun at the church and the corruption of the church. I mean, you might, just as an example, taking of kindergarten level in Latin, see the priest. The priest goes to Mass. The priest says the service. The priest goes to bed with his mistress. Naughty priest. You know, things like this. Here's the cardinal. Cardinal gets his red hat. cardinal pays the Pope for his red hat. He buys his office, you see. And the students are saying, this is great. This is funny. This is good. It is satire. And a satirist always has a serious intent under his humor. And the student said, you need to publish this. He said, oh, no, this just exercises for you, for my students. No, Erasmus, you need to publish it. He did. It was a bestseller. And he went on to translate the Bible, to translate the Fathers, to do critical editions of the Fathers, humanistic commentaries, essays, paraphrases on the Bible, works of theology, a Latin translation of the Bible, all kinds of works, most of them Christian. In 1505, he was prowling through a monastery in Louvain in the Low Countries, and he came upon an unpublished manuscript of Lorenzo Valla. Now, the year was 1505. Valla had lived back to the 15th century. Valla is the scholar who exposed the donation of Constantine as a forgery while he was still secretary to the Pope. And he proved that the Pope was basing his claim to the land he held in Italy on a forgery. Valla was a good scholar. And Valla had written a commentary on the New Testament, which shows that the Italian scholars were not all interested in secular matters. They had some Christian concerns also. He'd written a commentary on the New Testament. But in this commentary, he says over and over again, we are really working at a deficiency here. We have a problem because we don't have a reliable Greek New Testament text. These are late copies, they're not reliable, and we need a good New Testament text that would closely represent the original. And Erasmus saw a challenge. First of all, he decided he'd publish Valla's commentary on the New Testament. Then he said, I will take up this as a challenge. I will produce a text of the New Testament. And for the next 10 years, he examined all of the Greek manuscripts he could find, some very good ones. He did not see the Vatican manuscript because I don't think the Pope didn't make it available to him, but he examined the manuscripts that he had, and for 10 years, while he was working at the same time on an edition of Jerome, a critical edition of the Father Jerome, he was working on his New Testament text, and in 1516, he published that, seeking the Pope's endorsement, which he got. He published this text. This became the accepted New Testament text of the Bible until the 19th century. Hence, it was the text that Martin Luther used to translate the Bible into German in 1522, and a few years down the line was the text that was used by the Hampton Court scholars to produce the King James Bible in 1611. So if you have ever read the King James Bible, that translation, you are reading Erasmus' text. And now you see why I said it is important that Erasmus learned Greek. He finally got to go to Italy, doing the thing that he doesn't like, and that was teaching children. He had the opportunity to tutor some English children while he was escorting them to Italy, and that got him to Italy. And when he came to Italy, he saw that his reputation had preceded him. He was hailed as a hero. He worked with Aldus Manutius at Venice, who published an expanded edition of the Adasia for him. And I would say that at that time, printers didn't just set the type. Printers worked with the author to produce the edition, were involved in it. And Aldus was the most famous of all the printers. And if you have Aldus Manutius print your manuscript, you've got it made. And even today, an Aldine edition is priceless. And so he did that, worked with Aldus. He went to Florence, he went to Rome, he went everywhere. And he was famous by this time. There's some other works that he will produce just after he made the Italian journey. And we're kind of going through this chronologically. The most famous work that he produced is a work called Praise of Folly. You can buy it in bookstores today. It is a very interesting book. Again, it starts out as a satire, poking fun, saying everybody acts foolishly, that foolishness is what keeps the world going. We would be in bad shape if we weren't foolish. But then he begins to point out the foolishness of monks and nuns and priests and cardinals and popes. You begin to see he's getting pretty serious. Finally, he ends up by saying, you know, the biggest fool of all is the Christian, because he gives up everything for something that isn't even material. He wrote this little book. He was crossing the channel. He was going to stay with his friend Thomas More, and he said, I've got to have a house present for Thomas More, so I'll write him something. And he began to think, more. More in Greek means fool. That's funny. If I wrote a book, encomium, in praise of more, it could be translated in praise of foolishness, in praise of folly. He said, I got it. And so he wrote his satire with a play on More's name in Greek, in praise of folly, and has everybody bowing before the goddess folly. Later on, he was sorry he wrote it. He was afraid it'd get him in trouble with the Pope about the time he needed the endorsement for his New Testament text, and he kind of wrote a little apology for having written it. And yet today, that's his most famous work. Now, there's one work he published anonymously. He didn't put his name on it. He dared not put his name on it. Because you see, the most scandalous pope of the time was Julius II. He's the one who commissioned Michelangelo to paint the Sistine Chapel ceiling. But Julius was very immoral. Erasmus had gone to Italy. When he went to Italy, he saw him leading personally a siege on the city of Bologna. Very worldly. And so he wrote this little satire about Julius getting up to heaven, and Peter saying, what's your name? And he said, don't you see who I am? I am the Pope. Stand out of my way, fisherman. Bow down and kiss my ring. I am His Holiness, Pope Julius II. You should recognize me. You should bow before me. Don't stand in my way. And Peter says, excuse me? We're going to read your deeds. And all of his sins were read, and Peter sends him off to the other place. He doesn't get to go to heaven. Well, naturally, Erasmus didn't put his name on that one. He produced a book called the Enchiridion Militis Christiani that we'll look at more in detail next time, the Handbook of the Christian Soldier, for a woman who asked him if he would just write something to her husband who was very coarse and crude and not very spiritual, and encourage him to be a better Christian. That sets forth his view of Christianity that we will examine more in our next study. In his later years, he entered into the controversy with Luther. Again, we'll look at that more in detail. But for now, to say that Erasmus, when he published his edition of the New Testament, his text, his Greek text of the New Testament in 1516, was at that point, at the apex of his career, was called the Prince of Humanists, was the most feared, respected, and widely read of all authors. That he corresponded with anybody who was important. He was on the first-name basis with popes, emperors, kings, and princes. And yet, the events that unfolded in Germany would result in the eventual destruction of his program. And it is to that we'll turn later. In our next study, we will look at what Erasmus believed as a Christian.